Welcome to UO Today. I'm Paul Pepis, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. My guest today is fiction writer Susan Choi, author of 4 novels. The Foreign Student won the 1999 Asian American Literary Award for Fiction. American Woman was a finalist for the 2004 Pulitzer Prize. A Person of Interest was a finalist for the 2009 PEN/Faulkner Award. Her latest novel is My Education. Choi has been a recipient of fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts and the Guggenheim Foundation. She gave a reading at the University of Oregon on May 14, 2018, as a guest of the Clark Honors College and as part of UO's Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. Thank you, Susan, for coming on the show.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Tell us first about your background. Where'd you come from?
Where did I come from? Well, I was born in South Bend, Indiana, which is a college town. I grew up in Houston and moved to the Northeast to go to college, and I've been there ever since. My dad was a professor, and my mom was mostly an administrator.
So how did you wind up becoming a writer? How did you get there?
You know, I started writing at a really early age. I was a reader. I loved reading. And I wrote little stories before I had an inkling of a notion that you could do that for a living. When I got out of college, I didn't really know what else I wanted to do for a living. I'd always been writing on and off, and I finally got serious about it. But it's something that I did for fun, that I love doing.
So tell us about what inspired the first novel, The Foreign Student. Where did that idea come from?
The Foreign Student is a novel that in a lot of ways is based on my dad's experience. My dad is Korean. He emigrated to this country in the same year as the character in that book, to the same place as the character in that book emigrates to. So that novel's really telling the story of my dad's last years in Korea and his first years in this country. And it's enlivened with a lot of stuff that didn't really happen, but it originally started as a book that I wanted to use to explore stories he'd been telling me from, my childhood about the Korean War and about his experience coming here after the war was over.
Yesterday when you read, you told a very funny story about this. You said that your father, you had fictionalized a lot of this material because you didn't actually know all these stories. You didn't know, and you filled them in the novel, and then he read it and he verified that a lot of what you had imagined was basically right.
Yeah, or he verified, or he just sort of said, yeah, it was like that. I think that there were certain episodes that he alluded to, but didn't ever fill in the details of, and the details that I filled in seemed to be good enough for him, I guess.
Yes,
so.
You said that in some way you had, in fact, written his memories for him.
Yeah, well, retroactively, he decided to adopt them as such. I'm not pretending like I came up with his memories, but I think it was easier for him to say, sure, that's what happened.
Yes. So if your first novel was inspired by your father's story, your second novel, An American Woman, was inspired by 2 stories from the 70s, the story of Patty Hearst and the story of Wendy Yoshimura. I think most of our viewers know who Patty Hearst is, but who is Wendy Yoshimura?
Well, Wendy Yoshimura was someone who was a part of the Patty Hearst story. And I was originally, when I started writing American Woman, I was originally researching the Patty Hearst story to try to find a corner of it that was not already extensively written about. And I'm trying to remember the book because it was such a good and interesting book, but I was reading a nonfiction book about that case, and the book was full of just remarkable small details, the sort that like warms a novelist's heart, and that you don't often find in newspaper accounts of these cases. And in this book, one of the details was when Patty Hearst was arrested, she was living with a roommate. And when the FBI broke the door down, there was a letter lying on the kitchen table that the roommate had been in the middle of writing to her parents. And that was a letter from Wendy Yoshimura to her mom and dad. She turned out to be another young person who was living underground, so to speak. She'd been involved in the anti-war movement, and through a crazy chain of circumstance, she and Patty Hearst ended up sort of roommates on the run together. When I read the text of the letter reproduced in this book about Patty Hearst, I was so moved by it. I guess it was a portrait of a friendship that I hadn't known existed, and that ended up really being the spark for the book. And so I started looking for more information about who this person was, who this kind of, you know, in that book she was a footnote to Patty Hearst, but the character that I, you know, created around certain of those ideas. I mean, that character isn't Wendy Yoshimura, but she's inspired by her in a lot of ways. She moves to the center of that story.
I've read an interview with you where you say that you're interested in these stories that we already have, but perspectives on them that are very different from what we think. That is another part of that story that we don't know or isn't covered in the press. This sounds like a very good example of it.
Yeah, sort of, you know, the off-center view, unswept corner, you know, the person that you don't usually see at the center of attention.
So the third novel, A Person of Interest, tell us about the inspiration for that novel.
Well, that novel had so many different inspirations, and, you know, it's like the opposite of the unswept corner. I mean, these were a bunch of different news stories that I was really fascinated by, all of which were really prominent in their times. First and most obviously, the Unabomber case of the late 90s, you know, a series of university bombings being carried out by someone who was finally revealed to be a man called Ted Kaczynski. And then the rest of the inspiration for that novel were a number of cases in which a person is made into an object of suspicion without there being a lot of evidence, and they're labeled a person of interest, this actual sort of phrase that doesn't have it doesn't have a specific legal meaning, but it's very insinuating, and it's a very damaging label to have applied to you. So there were a bunch of real life cases that I was interested in. The case of Stephen Hatfill, who was thought to be the anthrax mailer, the case of Richard Jewell, who was thought to be the Atlanta Olympics bomber, the case of Wen Ho Lee, who was thought to be a spy. All of these people were labeled people of interest, and their lives were, you know, irreversibly changed. And so I was interested in all of that.
Yeah, and it was very interesting, the kind of failure of your character to behave in the way that, you know, we expect innocent people to behave.
Right.
That there's some sort of given way of being innocent,
Right.
and if you don't do it that way, you're guilty.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, it was interesting to me, especially because, you know, Stephen Hatfill is a good example of that. This real life person who was thought to be the anthrax mailer, and, you know, one of his big problems was it was really a PR problem. You know, when he got in front of cameras to protest his innocence, he was pissed off.
Yeah.
He was mad.
Yeah.
And he looked
Fair
mad.
enough.
Yeah, fair enough. But what did that make him seem to be?
Yeah.
But suspicious.
Yeah.
And so I thought a lot about the fact that innocence seemed to be a really exhausting performance. Like, how well would any of us do at it if we were under those pressures?
Not well.
Not well. Yeah, so that's what happens to my poor character. He does not do well.
Do you think of your first three novels as works of historical fiction? I mean, you've talked about where they're all sort of based in particular historical figures. Do you think of yourself as a historical novelist, or at least as those novels as historical novels?
I think of those novels as being historical fiction because they required research, because in all three cases there was a historical reality that I didn't want to get wrong, even though in every case I was telling a story that was made up. You know, even American Woman, which is, you know, inspired by the Patty Hearst kidnapping, takes tons of liberties. And so with all of my stories, at the center are characters that I create and situations that I create, but they were all embedded in a recognizable reality. I think that's the difference for me between historical fiction and just fiction, is that, to me, historical fiction is alluding to a historical reality that your readers might know about. And so if you get it wrong, that's going to, compromise the reading experience for them. So I think that's the definition that I carry of it.
So you say you did research for all three of these. So tell us a little bit about, you've begun to talk about it, but tell us how you understand the relationship of the research project to the fiction writing project.
Well, for me, the research project, there are a lot of different versions of it. So early on, the research project is often inspiring and super, fertile and productive. I get a lot of ideas doing research. Life is crazy. It is often stranger than art, especially right now. I mean, there's so many things that happen that it's impossible to make up. And so research to me is, it's almost a form of cheating sometimes. It's like a way to, kind of shake the trees of history and see what falls out and go like, wow, that would be a great story. But then research for me always becomes, after a while, kind of a procrastinating indulgence. I stick with it too long. I drag my feet about starting the writing. Then research becomes, a crutch, and I have to make myself stop. And then there's usually a third phase of research after I finally manage to write the book, where I circle back and try to fact check and, return to that desire to, represent the reality in a way that's not going to distract people through mistakes, obvious distortions.
So your most recent novel, My Education, is sitting right there. Would you mind reading a little bit of it for us?
Yeah, or rather, no, I wouldn't mind. I'd be glad to. Just a few pages from the beginning, I think. 1992. Since arriving the previous week, I'd kept hearing about a notorious person. And now, as I entered the packed lecture hall, my gaze caught on a highly conspicuous man. That's him, I declared inwardly, which of course was absurd. It was a vast university of thousands of souls. There was no reason these two kinds of prominence, scandalous noteworthiness and exceptional, even sinister attractiveness, must belong to the same human being. Yet they had. The man was Nicholas Brodeur, though I knew it for sure only later. That first time seeing him, even before being sure who he was, it was already clear that his attractiveness was mixed up with a great deal of ridiculousness. He wore a long duster coat in the heat of September. His filthy blonde hair stuck up and out in thatchy spikes from heavy use of some kind of pomade, as if it were 1982, not 92. And he wore linen shades and with completely black lenses, as if it were as if it were outdoors, not in. And overall, in his resemblance to a Joy Division poster, he comported himself as if 20 and not, as I'd come to find out, almost 40. Still, he was the best-looking man by a league in the room, and certainly the best-looking man I had seen in the flesh to that point in my life. I hadn't yet lived in one of the world's great cities where such specimens congregate, but even now that I have, he still ranks. And he must have realized there was in his posture a kind of inverse vanity, a suggestion that he engaged in his sartorial ridiculousness out of some impatience with the effects of his beauty. He stood alone at the back, his feet away from the wall, and his shoulders slumped against it. An ambiguous expression that was not quite a smile slightly lifted the sides of his mouth. His hands remained stuffed in the duster's deep pockets. The inappropriate hoodlum charade seemed to chide anybody who stared, as I did. Casper was the only fellow student in my program I'd managed so far to befriend. When he arrived and dropped into the seat I'd saved for him, I directed his eyes to the man. "Oh my," Casper said. "Do I want to fuck him or just be him?" Just being him did seem the lesser risk. I'd been inoculated against the villain Brodeur before I'd even enrolled. On my visit to campus the previous spring, my informational coffee with a second-year poetry student had been interrupted by a timorous, blushing undergraduate whom the second year had caught in a fervent embrace, then presented to me portentously as someone any woman considering coming here needs to talk to. In the course of preparing her senior thesis under Brodeur's direction, the undergraduate had been victimized by him. In what precise way, it would victimize her further to relate. The result thus far had been a petition demanding his firing, but the second year was confident that far more severe retribution would follow. This was only the most recent petition and the most recent of his crimes. He was rumored to ask female students to read done to him while he lay on the floor of his office in darkness. It was presumed masturbating. He was said to recite bawdy couplets referring to breasts while directing his gaze in the classroom at actual breasts. He had attended at the Repertory Cinema on campus a screening of a late-career, poorly received film by Roman Polanski, The Rapist. And unlike the rest of the solemn, censorious house, there to sharpen the critical blades, he had apparently laughed so hard as to have literally fallen from his seat onto the floor. Amid all this baleful intelligence, it came as a superfluous footnote that his relations with his wife, who was also a faculty member, were obscure and chaotic. I was as susceptible to this sort of gossip as anyone else. It impressed itself on me with more permanence than the titles of the texts I was required to read for my first set of courses. And yet, as opposite as they would seem from each other in worth, the salacious gossip and the scholarly imperatives, they were equally thrilling to me, different color threads of the same mantle, that of adulthood. Graduating from college, I'd suddenly found I'd grown up, and graduate school was my Eden, where I named and possessed all the precious first things, even those with a taint, like the villain Brodeur. Eagerly I absorbed Brodeur's villainous status as I did the rest of the new esoterica. Rents were cheaper off the hill than on. The better grocery store was Friel's, not Mighty Buy. Nicholas Brodeur was a predator, not to mention a sexist, whose continuing presence on campus proved the sorry truth of everything we'd learned in women's studies, and so was gratifying, though most of us wouldn't admit it. But for all my initiates' self-importance about Nicholas Brodeur and the rest, I hadn't been warned of his beauty, which for true initiates went without saying. Consciousness of his beauty, I understood now, thrilled beneath every condemnation. It was the shared secret that lent the condemning its eager subtext.
Thanks so much. So what inspired that book?
What inspired that book? So many things. I probably have spent too much time on campuses, and I think that after the first 3 books and all of that research, I really wanted to write a book about as it seemed to me when I started, smaller and simpler problems of people behaving very badly in relationships. Once I started the book, it became obvious that these are not simpler, smaller problems, but actually harder to write about than all of that other stuff. And I actually had a really enormous challenge writing this book. It was harder in a lot of ways than the 3 that had come before it, but I'd started it thinking, oh, this will be easy.
Fascinating. Most of the novel occurs in 1992, while Roberta Gottlieb, the protagonist, is in grad school, the speaker who you were just giving voice to. But the novel ends with a coda that takes place 15 years later in 2007. Why did you structure the book that way?
You know, when I first started thinking about the book, I was about the age that the protagonist is in that coda. I was, you know, an even more grown up than she is at the start of the book. I was married and had kids and a mortgage, and I had been thinking a lot about how incredibly foreign and distant to me my own early 20-something self seemed, as if that person was just from another planet. It was really hard for me to believe that that person had been an adult who, you know, operated independently in the world and made consequential decisions. And so, you know, that gap between the adulthood of the early 20s and this really different kind of adulthood of, you know, what was then my, I don't want to have to do the math, but 30s, that gap was really interesting to me. And initially it was just a gap in my own feelings and thoughts, but increasingly as I was writing the book, I started thinking that it was going to be a gap in the book itself, that it was going to be this jump that the book takes from these years of her 20s when Regina has really terrible judgment, actually. She has terrible judgment about all of the things that she thinks she really understands, about Nicholas Brodeur, about other people that she meets, and about herself. And I really wanted to kind of take the reader on the same sort of big leap from that period of her life when she makes a lot of really significant mistakes to this later period that that is so different. You know, it's hard for her to believe in her own continuity. Like, am I really the same person?
It seems like it's hard for all of us to believe in our own continuity when we get to that point.
Yeah, and it doesn't get easier.
The protagonists of all of the novels so far have been of Asian descent. Do you write consciously as an Asian American writer? Do you think of yourself as a writer, as an Asian American writer?
I don't think I think of myself as an Asian American writer at all, really. I think of myself as a writer. But I'm a writer who's really interested in Asian American people and their experiences. And with Regina, I didn't actually think a lot about who she was when I started writing this story. I just sort of plunged her into this circumstance that I wanted to test her with. And then subsequently, you know, when early readers would say like, well, you know, where'd she grow up? Who is she? I said, oh, well, I don't know. I guess like one of her parents is Asian and one isn't. I mean, it was just so funny how
she says, I'm German and my mother's Asian, I think at one point.
Yeah, yeah. And you know, it's obviously so close to my own background. You know, I have an Asian parent and I have a Caucasian parent of European descent, and that seems like such a normal way to be because that's me, I guess. So I gave her that too, and I think that, you know, in my other books, the specificity of being an Asian American has really mattered. In this book, that is not the aspect of Regina's experience that matters most, but it still comes into it.
So you have a new novel, Trust Exercise, which is forthcoming in 2019. Can you tell us anything about it? You willing to say anything about it?
I can say a little bit about it. It's you know, it's always like a bit of an exercise in storytelling to figure out how to describe your story. And I haven't actually had a lot of practice with this one because it's so new. It's set in the 80s in a high school.
Interesting.
So I've moved backwards from the university campus to the high school building. You know, a lot of the power dynamics that unfold in educational situations really interest me, and Trust Exercise is partly a story about students and teachers again, and the way my education was, and it's partly a story about lines being crossed, or people not really knowing where the lines are and feeling their way toward them and ending up on the wrong side. And so in that sense, maybe it connects a little bit with the concerns of my education, but I think it's also really different.
Interesting. I know that you, though you are largely or primarily a fiction writer, you sometimes write nonfiction. Is that something that you see as central to your identity as a writer, or is that a sort of very periodic thing that you do to write nonfiction?
Well, historically it's very periodic, but the question of what the difference is between fiction and nonfiction and what the most appropriate form for a given subject matter is, fiction or nonfiction, is really interesting to me. And I think that although I've written little nonfiction in the past, the question of whether certain stories I have in mind would be better served by nonfiction than fiction is becoming, you know, more more urgent to me, I guess, or more preoccupying. So it's hard to know, but there are projects that I'm working on now that I sometimes think like, is this a novel, or does this actually like want to be more of an essay, or more of a memoir, or just more of a piece of nonfiction?
Do you anticipate that you will write a memoir?
I don't anticipate that I will write a memoir, but I wonder if I will.
Uh-huh.
There's a lot of stuff that interests me. That's real stuff, and I've always really enjoyed taking those real things, like the Patty Hearst case in American Woman, or Wen Ho Lee in A Person of Interest, and finding ways to craft fictional stories that that examine those real issues in some way. Why not examine those issues through nonfiction too? At the same time, like, I'm not that experienced with nonfiction. I have no idea if I can write long-form nonfiction, but maybe I'll try it.
We had Andre Debus on the show last week, and he has a memoir called Townie, which he calls an accidental memoir because he started writing an essay, and this thing happened.
Yeah.
And it just became a memoir. So
Yeah.
I published a memoir.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think I may accidentally, write some other genre at some point. Usually, with me, it happens through failure.
So we just have about a minute left. This will be my last question. Is there anything new that you're working on that you might tell us a little bit about?
Well, I mean, I think I just did in a very coded way. I've been working on a story about my family history, and it's a story that I really thought would be a novel. And this is the thing that maybe is going to end up not being a novel. That's probably all I can say about it right now without confusing myself and you.
That's
yeah,
perfectly fine.
We'll see how it turns out.
Susan, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks for having me.
I've been speaking with fiction writer Susan Choi, author of 4 novels. Her latest book, My Education, was published in 2013. Choi gave a reading at the University of Oregon on May 14th, 2018, as a guest of the Clark Honors College and as part of the UO's Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. Thanks so much for watching.